December 19, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't turned his entire army 90 degrees north and reached Bastogne within 72 hours, 10,000 United States paratroopers would have been completely wiped out. Not captured, not forced to surrender. Wipe out. The man they called Old Blood and Guts was about to make a promise so insane, so impossible, that every other general in the room thought he'd lost his mind. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines. His men said it was because his guts and their blood made the combination work. His enemies said it was because he had ice in his veins and fire in his soul. The situation was catastrophic. Hitler had launched his last desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Over 200,000 German troops smashed through a thinly defended sector of the United States front line. Panzer divisions rolled through the snow-covered forests. The goal was clear: split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war. Right in the path of this German avalanche stood the town of Bastogne, a tiny Belgian crossroads town that nobody had heard of until that frozen December. 7 roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of armies. The German High Command knew it. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force knew it. And George Smith Patton knew it. Inside Bastogne, the United States Army's 101st Airborne Division was completely surrounded. Over 10,000 American paratroopers trapped in a shrinking perimeter. No supplies, no reinforcements, ammunition running desperately low. The Germans had them encircled with overwhelming force: panzer tanks, artillery, elite SS divisions. The weather made everything worse. Thick fog blanketed everything. Snow fell constantly. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Allied aircraft couldn't fly. No air support, no resupply drops, no reconnaissance. The men in Bastogne were on their own, staring at certain annihilation. Every senior commander at Supreme Headquarters knew the paratroopers were doomed. The question wasn't if Bastogne would fall. The question was how many days the defenders could hold out before being overrun. German panzers were literally at the edge of town. Tiger tanks prowled the perimeter. The noose tightened by the hour. But Old Blood and Guts was about to change history. December 19, 1944. Verdun, France. General Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. Every major Allied commander crammed into a cold, dimly lit room. The mood was grim. This was the darkest moment since D-Day. Some generals whispered about retreat, about giving up ground, about pulling back to regroup. General George Smith Patton walked into that room with a completely different mindset. Eisenhower stood before a map showing the German breakthrough. The bulge in the Allied lines looked like a dagger pointed at the heart of Belgium. He explained the situation. 20 divisions attacking, the front collapsing. Bastogne surrounded. Disaster unfolding. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss our response," Eisenhower said. Before anyone else could speak, Old Blood and Guts stood up. That famous grin on his face, those pearl-handled revolvers on his hips. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris," George Smith Patton said. "Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." The other generals stared at him like he'd suggested surrendering. But Patton wasn't joking about retreat. He was talking about a trap. Let the Germans overextend, then crush them. Eisenhower cut through the debate. "George, I want you to move to Luxembourg and take command of the battle. When can you attack?" This was the moment. Every eye in the room turned to George Smith Patton. "I've already made my plans," he said calmly. "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd. Dead silence. Absolute, stunned silence. 3 days. He was promising to turn his entire Third Army, over 200,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, 90 degrees from their current offensive, move them over 100 miles through winter weather on icy roads, reorganize completely, and launch a coordinated attack. In 72 hours, General Omar Bradley spoke up. "Don't be fatuous, George. There's no way you can be ready that quickly." Other generals nodded. It was impossible. Military operations of this scale required weeks of planning. You couldn't just spin an entire army around overnight. The logistics alone were staggering. Fuel, ammunition, food, communications, coordination between divisions, artillery positioning, reconnaissance, intelligence gathering. "When can you really attack?" Eisenhower asked, expecting a realistic answer. George Smith Patton didn't blink. On December 22nd, with 3 divisions, I stake my reputation on it. The room erupted in skepticism. Some generals actually laughed. They thought Old Blood and Guts had finally gone too far. His legendary aggressiveness had crossed into recklessness. This wasn't confidence. This was insanity. But Eisenhower saw something in Patton's eyes. Absolute certainty. "How can you possibly be ready?" Eisenhower demanded. "Because I already have 3 different attack plans drawn up," George Smith Patton replied. He pulled out actual written orders. He'd anticipated this exact scenario. While other generals were still trying to understand what was happening, Old Blood and Guts had already war-gamed multiple responses. "I'll hit them with the 3rd, 4th Armored, and 80th Infantry Divisions," Patton continued. "We'll drive straight north, smash through the German flank, and relieve Bastogne." "And if you can't?" Bradley asked. George Smith Patton's jaw tightened. "Then I don't deserve to wear this uniform." He'd just bet his entire career, his reputation, his legacy, everything. On reaching Bastogne in 3 days, the generals in that room thought he'd signed his own professional death warrant. The United States Army's most aggressive, controversial, brilliant, and maddening commander had just promised the impossible. Eisenhower made his decision. Do it. But could Old Blood and Guts really pull it off? The next 72 hours would tell. What happened next was the most extraordinary movement of troops in modern military history. The moment George Smith Patton left that meeting, his staff went into overdrive. He'd already alerted key commanders before the meeting even started. That's who Old Blood and Guts was. Always thinking 3 moves ahead. Always ready to attack. Over 200,000 men. Over 50,000 vehicles. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, supply wagons, ambulances. They all had to move north. Through Luxembourg, through Belgium, in the middle of winter. On frozen roads, through enemy territory. And they had to do it in secret. If the Germans discovered this massive redeployment, they'd adjust their offensive. They'd reinforce their southern flank. They'd make relieving Bastogne impossible. December 20th, 1944. The movement began. Picture this scene. Endless convoys rolling through the night, headlights off, moving by feel in the darkness. Trucks sliding on icy roads, tanks throwing tracks in the snow, men exhausted, freezing, wondering where they were going. But George Smith Patton was everywhere. Literally. He drove up and down the columns in his Jeep, shouting encouragement, cursing at traffic jams, directing traffic himself when bottlenecks formed. A 3-star general standing in the snow, waving tanks forward. "Move! Move! Move!" Old Blood and Guts roared at every convoy. "Men are dying in Bastogne." His staff officers couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Normal military doctrine said this operation required 2 weeks minimum. Patton was demanding it in 3 days. And his men were actually doing it. But the obstacles were crushing. Roads turned into ice rinks. Entire convoys skidded off roads. Tanks broke down in the cold. Fuel froze. Men suffered frostbite. Radio communications failed in the extreme weather. And they were moving toward the sound of guns, toward German forces that had just shattered an entire army corps. The soldiers in those convoys knew what awaited them. Battle, death, the strongest German offensive since Normandy. December 21st, 1944. Inside Bastogne, the situation deteriorated by the hour. The 101st Airborne Division was fighting for survival. German artillery pounded the town constantly. Panzer attacks came from every direction. United States paratroopers held makeshift defensive positions in the freezing cold. Ammunition rationing began. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded men died because there was no morphine, no bandages, no blood plasma. The German commander sent a surrender demand. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply, "Nuts." But bravery doesn't stop panzer tanks. The perimeter shrank. German forces captured outlying positions. More United States soldiers died defending buildings, street corners, foxholes and frozen ground. The situation was beyond desperate, and Old Blood and Guts was still 50 miles away. His 3rd Army divisions hit resistance. German rearguard units realized something was happening. Firefights erupted along the roads. The 4th Armored Division ran into prepared German positions, anti-tank guns, minefields, machine gun nests. This is where George Smith Patton's genius showed. Lesser generals would have stopped to clear every pocket of resistance methodically. Patton ordered his commanders to bypass anything that wasn't directly blocking the road. Don't fight them if you don't have to, Old Blood and Guts commanded. Drive around them, leave them for follow-up units. Bastogne can't wait. It was revolutionary thinking. Forget traditional military doctrine about securing flanks and clearing sectors. Just drive. Drive north. Drive toward the surrounded paratroopers. Speed mattered more than perfect execution. But it was incredibly risky. United States columns had German forces on both sides. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. If the Germans counterattacked the flanks, entire divisions could be cut off and surrounded themselves. Patton didn't care. "I'd rather lose half my army reaching Bastogne than fail to reach it at all," he told his staff. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. This absolute willingness to accept casualties for victory. This aggressive spirit that terrified his own generals almost as much as it terrified the enemy. December 22nd, 1944. The day George Smith Patton had promised to attack. The 4th Armored Division led the assault. Sherman tanks roared forward through snow-covered hills. Infantry followed in half-tracks. Artillery batteries unlimbered and fired rolling barrages ahead of the advance. They hit the German lines like a sledgehammer. Panzer Grenadier divisions that had been pushing toward Bastogne suddenly found themselves under massive attack from the south. German commanders were shocked. Where had this force come from? How had an entire United States army appeared on their flank? But the Germans were elite troops. They didn't break easily. They fought back hard. Tank battles erupted across frozen fields. United States Shermans faced German Panthers and Tigers. Village streets became killing zones. Every farmhouse became a fortress. The advance slowed. Hours passed. Miles that should have taken 30 minutes took 3 hours. Casualties mounted. Tanks burned. Men died in the snow. Inside his headquarters, George Smith Patton stared at maps. Reports flooded in. Resistance heavier than expected. Progress slower than required. Bastogne still surrounded. Still under attack. Old Blood and Guts made a decision that defined his character. He drove to the front, not to a command post miles behind the lines, to the actual front, where tanks were fighting, where bullets were flying. He found the commander of the 4th Armored Division's lead combat command. "Why have you stopped?" Patton demanded. "Sir, we're taking heavy fire. We need to bring up more artillery support before—" "Bastogne is dying," George Smith Patton roared. "I don't care about your casualties. I don't care about proper procedure. You will attack now. You will reach those paratroopers. Or I will find someone who will." That was Old Blood and Guts. Harsh, demanding, absolutely focused on the mission above everything else. His own reputation, his soldiers' lives, everything was secondary to accomplishing the objective. The attack resumed. Sherman tanks pushed forward even as German anti-tank rounds tore into them. Infantry charged across open ground. Men died, but the advance continued. This is the reality of what George Smith Patton demanded. Blood, sacrifice, casualties. The nickname wasn't a joke. It was literal truth. Old Blood and Guts drove his men harder than any commander in the United States Army. But they followed him. They trusted him. Because he'd never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Because he was there, in the middle of it, sharing the danger. December 23, 1944. Still 15 miles from Bastogne. The weather cleared slightly. Allied aircraft finally flew. They airdropped supplies into Bastogne. Medicine, ammunition, food. The paratroopers had breathing room. But they were still surrounded. Still fighting for survival. George Smith Patton's divisions ground forward. Village by village, hill by hill. The 4th Armored Division led the way. The 26th Infantry Division attacked on the left flank. The 80th Infantry Division pushed on the right. German resistance stiffened. They knew what was happening now. They threw everything at Patton's forces. Every available unit. Panzer counterattacks, artillery barrages, desperate defensive stands. December 24, 1944. Christmas Eve. 10 miles from Bastogne. Inside the surrounded town, United States paratroopers held their lines. Barely. German attacks came constantly. The situation was beyond critical. Men fought with empty rifles. Medics operated without anesthesia. Wounded soldiers lay in frozen cellars. But they could hear something. Artillery fire from the south. Growing closer, George Smith Patton was coming. Old Blood and Guts pushed his commanders mercilessly. "Faster! They're counting on us!" Tank crews fought for 30 hours straight without sleep. Infantry marched until men collapsed from exhaustion. Artillery batteries fired until barrels glowed red-hot. This was warfare at its most brutal, most demanding, most costly, and George Smith Patton was in the middle of it all, directing traffic, shouting orders, pushing exhausted men to give more than they thought possible. German commanders couldn't believe what they were facing. Captured intelligence documents later revealed their shock. How had the United States Third Army moved this quickly? How was this even possible? They called George Smith Patton, that crazy cowboy general who fought like no other Allied commander. December 25, 1944, Christmas Day, 5 miles from Bastogne. December 26, 1944, 4:30 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division. Sherman tanks grinding through the snow. German positions on both sides firing everything they had. The road to Bastogne was a corridor of death, but they pushed through. Tank after tank. Losses didn't matter anymore. Only reaching those paratroopers mattered. Then Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank, saw something ahead through his periscope. United States soldiers, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, running toward his tanks, waving, shouting. "Come on!" the paratroopers yelled. "This way!" The siege was broken. General George Smith Patton had done it. At 4:50 in the afternoon, the first vehicles of the United States Third Army rolled into Bastogne. Paratroopers surrounded the trucks. Exhausted men embracing exhausted men, some cried. Battle-hardened veterans wept openly. Inside his headquarters, George Smith Patton received the radio message. Contact established with Bastogne garrison. Old blood and guts allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. Then he immediately started issuing orders for widening the corridor, bringing in more supplies, evacuating the wounded. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of destroying the German offensive. But he'd done what he promised. What every other general said was impossible. Turned an entire army 90 degrees, moved over 100 miles, launched a coordinated attack, broke through German defenses, relieved a surrounded garrison in 72 hours. Exactly as he'd promised, on December 19th, news spread through the Third Army like wildfire. Soldiers who'd been cursing old blood and guts for driving them so hard suddenly understood why. They'd saved 10,000 paratroopers from annihilation. They'd stopped the German offensive. They'd changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. Inside Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe met with officers from the relief force. "How did you get here so fast?" McAuliffe asked. "We didn't expect relief for at least another week. General Patton promised to reach you in 3 days," the officer replied. "Old blood and guts keeps his promises." McAuliffe shook his head in amazement. That magnificent son of a bitch actually did it. The soldiers defending Bastogne had been prepared to die. They'd written last letters home, made peace with their fate, prepared for a final stand against overwhelming odds. Then George Smith Patton appeared like an avenging angel at the head of an army. This is why his men loved him. Why they followed him through hell. Because when things looked darkest, when death seemed certain, old blood and guts came through. Always attacking, always aggressive, always refusing to accept defeat. The Germans were shocked. Their offensive plan had depended on maintaining momentum, on the Allies being slow to react, on traditional military procedures that would take weeks to redeploy forces. They hadn't planned for George Smith Patton. They hadn't anticipated a general willing to take enormous risks, a commander who moved at speeds they thought impossible. Captured German officers interrogated after the battle admitted one thing consistently. They feared Patton more than any other Allied general. When German intelligence identified which sector he commanded, they immediately classified it as the highest threat area. Frontline German troops dreaded facing his Third Army. Why? Because old blood and guts fought differently. He attacked when others defended. He moved when others rested. He took casualties other generals wouldn't accept. He won when everyone else expected failure. The relief of Bastogne became the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive ground to a halt, their spearheads overextended, their fuel ran out. And George Smith Patton's Third Army kept attacking, driving them back, destroying divisions that had been Hitler's last reserve. But in that moment, on December 26th, as those first Sherman tanks rolled into Bastogne, all that mattered was this. 10,000 United States paratroopers would go home to their families. They would survive the war. Because one general refused to accept the impossible, Old blood and guts had done it again. The Battle of the Bulge raged for weeks after Bastogne's relief, but the German offensive was effectively broken. What George Smith Patton accomplished in those 72 hours changed everything. General Dwight Eisenhower later wrote in his memoirs, "Patton's brilliant movement of the Third Army to relieve Bastogne was one of the most remarkable achievements of the war." Coming from a commander who often clashed with old blood and guts over tactics and temperament, this was extraordinary praise. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who rarely praised anyone except himself, privately admitted, "I couldn't have done what Patton did. That kind of speed and aggression isn't in the British military tradition." But the highest praise came from German commanders. After the war, captured German generals were interviewed extensively about Allied leadership. Almost universally, they named George Smith Patton as the Allied general they feared most. General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, stated, "Patton was always the most feared general on the Western Front. We tried to plan for his attacks, but he moved faster than our intelligence could track. He was unpredictable, aggressive, and absolutely ruthless in exploiting any advantage." General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr Division, said, "We called him the Cowboy General. He fought more like a German panzer commander than an American. When we identified his units on our front, we knew we were in for a fight unlike any other." These weren't compliments from allies trying to be polite. These were admissions from enemies who'd fought against every Allied general. They'd faced Montgomery in North Africa. They'd faced Bradley in France. They'd analyzed Eisenhower's strategies, and they consistently ranked George Smith Patton as the most dangerous. The United States press went wild with the story. Headlines screamed about the miracle relief of Bastogne. Old blood and guts became a national hero. Again, magazine covers featured his stern face beneath that famous helmet with 4 stars. But Patton himself dismissed the attention. In his diary he wrote, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. We didn't do anything extraordinary. We just refused to accept that it was impossible." That was his philosophy in one sentence. Aggressive action now beats perfect planning later. It's why he succeeded where other generals failed. It's why he could promise something impossible and then actually deliver. The military impact was profound. The relief of Bastogne destroyed German momentum completely. Hitler's last major offensive in the West collapsed. The divisions he'd committed to the Ardennes offensive were destroyed or severely damaged. They could never be replaced. From that moment on, Germany was purely on the defensive. No more strategic offensives. No more surprise attacks. Just a slow, grinding retreat back to Germany. And George Smith Patton's Third Army led the pursuit. Always attacking, always advancing. Old blood and guts doing what he did best, destroying enemy forces. The logistics experts, who said moving the Third Army in 72 hours was impossible, later studied what actually happened. They concluded it was still impossible. Patton had simply done it anyway. He'd ignored established doctrine, accepted enormous risks, pushed his staff and soldiers beyond normal limits, and accomplished something that shouldn't have worked. One staff officer later wrote, "Working for General Patton was like being strapped to a lightning bolt. You never knew where you'd strike next, but you knew it would be explosive." The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division never forgot who saved them. For the rest of their lives, whenever veterans of Bastogne gathered, they toasted one name, George Smith Patton, old blood and guts, the general who refused to let them die. Eisenhower awarded Patton the Distinguished Service Cross for the operation. But old blood and guts valued something else more, the knowledge that he'd proven every doubter wrong, every general who'd laughed at his promise, every expert who'd said it was impossible. He'd shoved their skepticism down their throats with pure audacity and execution. This was the essence of George Smith Patton. He didn't care about being liked. He didn't care about following rules. He cared about winning, about destroying the enemy, about bringing his soldiers home alive. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States Army over 80,000 casualties. But Bastogne held. Those 10,000 paratroopers survived, and the German offensive collapsed, all because one general made an impossible promise and then kept it. Today, military historians and strategists still study the relief of Bastogne. The United States Army War College uses it as a case study in rapid redeployment, aggressive leadership, and decisive action. Staff colleges around the world analyze how George Smith Patton accomplished what every military expert said couldn't be done. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Yes, he He moved over 200,000 men in 72 hours. Yes, he attacked on exactly the day he promised. Yes, he broke through German defenses and relieved Bastogne. The real story is about the kind of leader who could make that happen. Who could inspire exhausted men to march beyond endurance? Who could convince tank crews to attack against overwhelming odds? Who could turn impossible into inevitable through sheer force of will? They called him Old Blood and Guts. For a reason. Because he understood warfare at its most fundamental level. War isn't about perfect plans or careful logistics. War is about will, about aggression, about imposing your determination on the enemy until they break. George Smith Patton broke the German army in ways that went beyond tactical victories. He broke their spirit. When German soldiers knew they faced the Third Army, they knew they were fighting a force that wouldn't stop, wouldn't slow down, wouldn't give them time to rest or reorganize. Old Blood and Guts created a culture of relentless offensive action. His staff officers joked grimly that planning a defense under Patton was career suicide. He wanted one thing: attack plans. When do we attack? Where do we attack? How do we attack? Never. How do we hold? This mindset won World War II. Not just Patton's victories, but the aggressive Allied strategy he championed. While other generals worried about consolidating gains and securing flanks, Old Blood and Guts pushed for constant pressure. Keep attacking. Keep the enemy off balance. Never let them recover. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, was the perfect expression of this philosophy. Everyone said wait. Wait for better weather. Wait for more preparation. Wait for the situation to clarify. George Smith Patton said no, attack now, move now, win now. And he was right. The paratroopers he saved went on to fight through Germany. Many of them survived the war, came home to wives and children, built lives and families, all because one general refused to accept that saving them was impossible. That's the real measure of George Smith Patton's genius. Not the tactical brilliance, though he had that. Not the strategic vision, though he demonstrated it consistently. The real genius was understanding that in war, audacity matters more than caution. That bold action beats careful planning. That the impossible only stays impossible if you accept it as such. Old Blood and Guts never accepted limitations. Never believed the experts who said something couldn't be done. He looked at impossible situations and saw opportunities. He turned crises into victories through sheer aggressive will. This is why the United States military still studies him. Why his tactics and strategies are taught at every level of professional military education. Why leaders in every field, not just military, look to George Smith Patton as an example of decisive leadership. He wasn't perfect. He was controversial. He made enemies. He offended politicians and alienated fellow generals. He pushed his men harder than they thought they could endure. But when everything was on the line, when 10,000 men faced annihilation, when the Battle of the Bulge threatened to destroy months of Allied progress, George Smith Patton delivered. He made an impossible promise. And he kept it. That's why they called him Old Blood and Guts. That's why his name still echoes through military history. That's why when people talk about the greatest combat commanders in American history, General George Smith Patton is always at the top of the list. The legend of Old Blood and Guts didn't come from propaganda. It came from moments like Bastogne. Real crises, real battles, real victories when everyone else expected defeat. And that's why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Because when American soldiers were dying, surrounded, out of ammunition, and out of hope, he came through that German cordon like an avenging angel at the head of an army, exactly when he promised he would. If this story of Old Blood and Guts racing against time, against impossible odds, against every expert who said it couldn't be done, moved you, hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you more untold moments from General George Smith Patton's incredible military career. More stories of the battles that made him a legend. More moments when this fearless American commander looked at impossible odds and attacked anyway. Because the story of George Smith Patton isn't just military history. It's a lesson in leadership, in determination, in refusing to accept defeat. And the world needs those lessons now more than ever. This is what happened when Old Blood and Guts bet his career on reaching Bastogne in 3 days. He won that bet. Those 10,000 paratroopers went home. And military history was changed forever.